welcome back to this episode of the PodShop. I am your host, Caitlin, and with us today again is my wonderful co-host, Jeremy,
Hello.
owner of Conversa. And we have a very exciting episode for you today regarding more audio magic. But before we dive into that, I wanted to shout out to our last episode, which was a recording we did with Michael. And in that episode, we went over the producer, like what is a producer and all of that. So if you want to learn more, you should go back an episode and check that out. But moving forward, we have some cool audio mixing and mastering, if you could tell by the thumbnail. And if you'd like to learn more, I am excited to introduce Josue. Josue was on the first episode of the Pod Shop. And so on this one, we're going to learn a little bit more about mixing and mastering and kind of what goes into that. So without further ado, Josue, would you like to introduce yourself and speak a little bit on your experience?
Sure. So I'm Josue Gonzalez. I'm originally from Costa Rica, and I studied abroad in the US for 7 years. I got my degree in music from there, and I've always been very interested in audio. And so, one of my biggest passions is music, of course. So I decided to go into film scoring first, and then I decided to also get a degree in audio engineering, which I got from Berklee College of Music, for those of you who know that. And it was a great time, that I spent there in the U.S. I really got into the weeds of audio engineering, mixing, and mastering, and I'm sure we'll discuss what mixing and mastering is. But I basically spent a long time there in the U.S., and it was a lot of fun. I got to also work with a lot of musicians who recorded their own their own music with me. I got to work on sound design projects, video game projects, film scoring projects, and many more that really developed my skills in terms of mixing and mastering.
Josue, kind of leading into it, could you explain what is mixing? What is mastering? What does that mean when you say it like that when it comes to podcasting? Because it means a few different things regarding music and then versus like actual interview conversations. So could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I guess mixing in the most simplistic way of putting it is just grabbing different pieces of audio and putting them together. Now, how you do that, that's where the art comes in, right? Because you need to put all those pieces together in a proper manner so that it doesn't sound like one audio is overpowering the other one, or maybe one piece of audio is too soft, the other one is too loud, and maybe one of them is like over compressed, which also we're going to talk about a little bit, about this whole concept of compression. But of course, mixing in its whole means putting all those pieces together so that it sounds very clear and broadcast ready, basically. If we're talking about podcasting, of course, in music, it means putting all the instruments together, right? Like you have the drums, you have the piano, you have all the instruments, and you have to put them together so that each of them has its own place. So I would say that we have a frequency spectrum in which we want to put every different element so that it doesn't clash with each other. And so in podcasting, it's kind of the same thing. If you have a very high pitched voice, and then you have a very, like, let's say, mid high pitched voice, then of course you need to put them in a certain spectrum of frequencies so that they don't clash with each other, but rather that they converse with each other. And so that's the whole idea behind mixing.
Josue, I think that it's important to distinguish too that mixing is different than editing, right? And
Absolutely.
and because I think that editing is something that like our clients and most people can kind of understand. It's you're taking stuff out, maybe putting stuff in, right? Taking out a lot of the filler words, the ums and the ahs, and kind of stitching the whole thing together. Um, but how does mixing relate to editing? Because they're not totally divorced from each other either. They're different processes, but they're all part of the post production. So how do they work together?
Right. So I think, as you mentioned, it's well connected. And for example, I'm gonna give a very brief example here, and that's when someone breathes into the mic, for example. And of course, you can take all the breaths uh, out of the recording, and then just forget about it. Or you could have those breaths and make them sound natural, which is the other option, right? And so that could either be taken out in the editing process or in the mixing process. Now, these are two different approaches, because one of them is going to be a little more, I wouldn't say professional, but it's also like more detailed. It's more detailed. And so if you take, for example, those breaths away in the mixing process, then that's going to be more detailed, because you're also going to be using some other effects like compression, de-essing, which is something that people don't know about. Most times people ignore that. And de-essing is basically just taking all these sounds away from a recording, which can be very common depending on the mic that people are using, depending on the interface that they're using. Or if, let's say, they're recording like straight from the computer, then that becomes a whole problem, of course.
Now, you mentioned you can also take out the breath sounds in by editing them out, right? Selecting those bits and taking them out. So, and you're suggesting that doing it in mixing is more subtle, maybe, right? Or sort of a more detailed process. So, what does that mean? Why is that arguably like a better way to do it?
Let me put it this way, because I am always very hesitant to say that there is only one way to do things. I would say in the editing process, it's obviously going to be more detailed, because you're going to be looking at the waveform, and so you're going to be able to take that entire breath out of the recording. But when you're mixing, you can actually control the breath itself, and you can make it louder or softer by adding plugins to it. For example, we have a de-breath module that we use, and that's one plugin that RX by Isotope has, for example. And this is a software that restores audio. And for our listeners, this is a very, very good software, by the way. If someone has the chance to buy it, it's a great one. I strongly recommend that one. And this way, of course, you can control how much of that breath you want, how you can equalize that breath. For example, if it's in a very high pitched frequency, then you can put that breath maybe in a mid high frequency, something like that. And so you have definitely more control over that breath.
I do have a question about, like, when we're talking about breath, and especially with podcasting and radio work. So I have a background in radio, and I'd like to hear your perspective on that. So would you say that it is more traditional now to, or like pretty industry standard, to cut out breaths? So like if anyone is finishing a sentence, take a pause. Do you think that you should keep in the breaths or some of them, or exclude all of them? Because maybe, like, from a perspective that was shared with me, was that you could sound like a robot. You run the risk of sounding like a robot if you cut out all the breath. So I'm curious, what do you think about that?
I think breathing is natural, so I don't think we we should take away the breaths from, like, all the breaths from the recording. However, if someone is having this heavy breathing in a recording, then I think it's necessary, like, you know, right, like that kind of breathing.
Am I
Thank you,
breathing
Jeremy,
too
you
Jeremy.
loud?
okay?
I can't hear you, Jeremy.
Just a little out of breath.
Sounds like Liv, can we get like a serial killer sound
That's just
right
how I
about
breathe.
now?
It's just my natural breathing.
It's like, this is like turning into a serial
Yeah.
killer, like horror movie aspect.
So, of course, breathing is natural. It's a natural process. But what I do think is it depends on what kind of breathing the person is doing, really. Because it can get into what the person is saying and really, kind of like bother the listener. And so I think it really depends. What I do is I try to, be very critical, and try to, just think whether it enhances the recording, or if it doesn't, then I'm probably just taking them away, right? But I think breathing is natural. Of course, sometimes people decide to just take everything out, and that's a fine approach. I don't criticize it, but even in some songs, like if you listen to some Adele songs, like you actually have the breaths in there, and it's actually very interesting, the approach they take. It sounds very natural. It sounds as if they were like talking, right? Like just in a normal room. And I think it's totally fine to do that. I don't think there is a problem with that. So yes, two different approaches for sure. In radio, I think most people nowadays take away the breaths, but yeah, it's a choice. It's a matter of choice.
It's interesting that you mention music, right? And Adele is one example, um, because I think like ultimately Adele's producers or any producers of podcast or whoever, they're listening and obviously they hear that. And then they have to make a choice. Do we leave it in? Do we take it out? And I think ultimately it's going to be, well, what serves the end product, right? Does this make the song better somehow? Even if you didn't, maybe it's a surprise. You're like, oh, that sounds cool. Actually, let's leave that in. Or not. Or no, it's distracting. Let's take it out. And I think it's sort of the same thing for a podcast, right? At least for our clients, our goal is always to what's going to make this episode the best overall. And it's not always the same answer, right? It depends on even an individual episode, even an individual part of an individual episode. And it can even be kind of hard to explain exactly why, but you hear it and you're like, oh, that sounds good. That actually sounds good. Didn't expect it to, but it does.
Well, it makes me think that like the like kind of echoing your point, Jeremy, like the genre of podcast content you're making too. So like a teaser could be the same episode, like say it's a mental health and wellness podcast or something. The teaser probably won't have those breaths because you're trying to be very like high energy and engaging, but perhaps like maybe it would be more appropriate if you're like connecting with the singular host or something like that and talking about those topics. So um this is a great topic, but I do have a couple questions, kind of more audio related. So we'll move on to the next one. Now, Josue, you gave me a few show and tell kind of audio clips that we can look at for this episode. So I'm very excited to move on to that. So let's go ahead. I'm going to share my audio so that we can go ahead and see the raw version of an audio clip that Josue gave me. And let's just kind of, Jeremy, you and I, as non experts, can kind of give our opinion on it. And let's see what Josue has. So I'm going to share my screen.
And the idea is that when that work is done, and it'll be done this fall, it will help inform development of the C133 chapter.
Okay. So this was just some raw audio that was taken, so prior to any editing. Okay, gotcha. Jeremy, what do you think of, I know it was like a short clip, but what's your thoughts and takeaways just from that small bit? What did you notice?
Yeah, well, you can hear there's some noise, right? Maybe that's somebody hitting the mic or the mic hitting something. It's a little, maybe it's a little loud, right? It's a little noisy and a little distracting.
Yeah, I have the same note, just like a lot of background noise. The audio, like his voice sounds good, but it's just we're picking up more too. We're picking up more than his good voice. Um, so let's see. And Josue, now we're gonna get to listen to like what Josue did to it. So let me go
Yeah.
ahead.
And so actually, before we do, so Josue, when you got this clip and you hear just the raw audio, what are you hearing? And what does that mean?
Well, I'm gonna tell you a secret. This was recorded on a boat.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. So
That's
this was
so
recorded on a
cool.
On a
boat.
boat.
Yeah. Yeah, on a boat. The person was recording on a boat. So that noise that you're hearing, it's actually the wind. And so yeah, and so what I heard first, when I listened to this, is of course, I heard the wind, and then I'm hearing that his voice has a huge dynamic range. So that's also one thing that I had to fix, by compressing and putting it in the front, right? Because it's kind of like in the background. If you hear his voice, it's kind of like in the background because the wind is overpowering his voice. And so, these are some of the things that I heard first. And of course, there is some clipping there as well, some clicking, which is something that I also heard. And so, when I got this audio file, I had to equalize it, compress it, and then put it in the front as well, right? So that it sounds a lot better. And of course, remove the background noise.
Okay. All right. So let's listen to the edited version that
Yeah,
Josue
I'm
worked on.
really excited, especially now that
Yeah.
I know it was on a boat.
And the idea is that when that work is done, and it'll be done this fall, it will help inform development of this C133 chapter 4.
Okay. Wow. So
Wow.
it's just obviously, right, all that background, it's a lot clearer. The wind sounds are gone, and the voice is just really front and center. So nice job on that. I mean, one takeaway for me is don't record on a boat. Just try not to be on a boat if at all possible. You know,
I
listeners,
was
if you
gonna
weren't sure
say.
about that, boats typically not the best place to record a
To record
podcast.
a podcast, for
Yeah.
sure. For
I
sure.
mean, or just have like a killer mixer and master like like Josue. Seriously, like that sounds really good. Like after you went through all that, because you've been using words like de-esser, equalizer, like so it is a lot more complex than just turning on your microphone and recording, you would say.
Right, and I think, going back to your point, Kaylin, I think of course, one of the biggest issues in podcasting is that all people want to record their podcast at home, which is not a bad thing, in a way. But I definitely think that, if you want to get your podcast to a very high level, you want to make it like a broadcast podcast kind of thing, right? Then of course you need to go to someone who really knows how to compress, how to mix and master, to really get it up to that point. Because of course, just like with music, you can create your own music at home, but it's not going to be the same result as if you record in a studio, right? So of course, I'm not saying that you cannot record your own podcast at home, but what I'm saying is, depending on what you want, then you might need some help.
Just a practical question. Those wind sounds were really prominent when we heard it the first time, and now they're completely gone. So how do you get rid of those?
Here comes a topic where one has to be very careful, and that's the topic of denoising, because denoisers have to be very carefully used. Otherwise, you'll make the person sound as if the person was a robot, because it adds some artifacts to the recording. And so, what I think is that there isn't like one single way of removing noise. I think it's a combination of different elements. And so, just relying on one denoiser to remove noise, I think that's the wrong approach. And for example, not using an equalizer to remove noise, to remove the low end of a recording, I think that's a mistake, because then you're making that denoiser work very, very hard to remove all that noise, which what ends up happening is you have, okay, yes, you won't have the noise, but then the voice is going to be very, very robotic sound like, right? And so you don't want to have that result as well. You want to make it sound as natural as possible. And so what my approach is I tend to use dialogue isolators more than voice denoisers, which I definitely think is a better option. And of course, it's going to take more rendering time, because it takes about probably like 3 times the time to denoise something, of course, because you have to run the plugin real time, which means that you're going to be listening to the recording as the plugin works. And so that's a different approach, but I definitely think it's way more professional, and I think it's going to leave the natural sound of the recording. So which is the case with this recording. I didn't use a denoiser, but rather a dialogue isolator, and I de-reverbed the recording, which is another type of plugin that I use.
So, for our listeners who don't have experience working with audio, just want to clarify a few things. You use the word plugin, right? And so that's, as I understand it, and this might not be the clearest way of explaining it, that of course we're talking about digital audio here, right? So you're using a digital audio workstation like Logic Pro or Adobe Audition or whatever, right? And that's a plugin essentially is like an additional piece of software that you kind of digitally plug in for a specific purpose. In this case, the dialogue isolator. Now, I've actually never heard of that. What is a dialogue isolator, and how is it different than a denoiser?
Let's put it this way. Voice denoiser is basically just taking all the sound that it finds in a recording, like every background noise that it finds in the recording, away from the recording, right? And so, for example, if the voice denoiser finds that the person kind of like rubbed the mic, with their clothes or something like that, then it will take that away, right? Like what you're doing exactly, like that kind of thing. it will take it away. But the dialogue isolator is way smarter than the voice denoiser. The dialogue isolator really only isolates your voice. So it takes away like everything, all the background noise, but it leaves your voice sounding natural without touching any frequencies of your voice. So it's everything that's, kind of like apart from your voice. And so the difference, I know it's a very kind of like small difference, but it really makes a difference in how you hear that. And so I incline towards that one more than the denoiser for sure.
Okay, that's cool. So that piece of software has sort of been designed to recognize, oh, that's a human voice. Don't touch it, and distinguish it from the background noise, which is a not human noise, and that you can get rid of. And if I'm hearing you right, so the advantage there is with a denoiser, it's affecting everything, including also the human voice. And so, like you say, if you're not careful, it can make you sound robotic or sort of washed out. But so with this dialogue isolator, you're not running into that problem. And I'm assuming you still need to use it just so and know what you're doing. But
Right, you have to know your parameters. Yeah, yeah, because all these plugins, they have parameters that you're gonna have to eventually get to know, deeply, just so you can really, get to the point where it's perfect, right? And I mean, of course, it's never gonna be entirely perfect, but you try to get there.
And there are just, I mean, one thing that's so cool about digital audio workstations, DAW, right, and all these plugins, there's sort of an endless amount of plugins for pretty much anything you can think of, any problem you're trying to solve. Chances are there's a plugin that you can at least try to use to solve that problem.
Absolutely, and especially with RX, which is one of the software pieces of software that I use. That one has a ton of options. So as I said, with with Isotope, you can really take different approaches. So if let's say the voice denoiser doesn't work, okay, maybe you can work with the dialogue isolator. If the dialogue isolator doesn't work, then maybe you can try the de-reverb option, right? And so it really depends on the problem that the recording has, because sometimes there was this time when I had recording that had a lot of background noise, like a lot of low end. And so I thought, okay, I'm just gonna use an EQ. I'm gonna take that out, but it didn't work because what ends up happening is that it was not only affecting the low frequencies, but it was affecting the mid low frequencies. And so I had to use some different tools. So this is why I'm saying that there isn't like one specific approach, for each recording, and each recording is going to be different every time.
Now, you've mentioned compression a few different times, and I think I've spent plenty of time with DAWs and doing this kind of stuff, but I still don't totally understand compression and how it works. Like, I've used it and I kind of know what the effect can be, but I don't really understand it. Just so, like, for, as though you're explaining it to a 5-year-old, which essentially I am when it comes to compression, at least. What is compression and how does it work?
Okay, in the most simple manner, let's put it this way: compression is basically removing the low and high peaks of a recording and really leveling all that recording so that you don't have to really, turn your speakers up when it's soft and turn them down when it's loud, right? But you can have them at one specific volume and really listen to that recording without having to, kind of like boost your volume up or down, right? So you just keep it.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, there's a lot more I'm sure you could say about
Oh,
compression.
a, a ton. I mean, we
Yeah,
could spend hours here, talking about compression for sure.
yeah.
Because what happens is compression is not only a matter of volume, and this is what most people think, right? When they apply compression, they apply it to remove the peaks, the high peaks and the low peaks. But that's actually not the whole point of compression. It's one of the points, that you want to, of course, why you want to use compression. But it also shapes the tone of the voice. So depending on which compressor you use, and I mean there are like more than, I don't know, maybe more than 1,000 compressors. Well, not that many, more than 100 maybe, compressors in the industry, and each of those compressors is going to make your voice sound different. So if we're talking about digital compression versus analog compression, that's a total different thing. Because of course, we were talking about plugins, and that's what we use the most when we, edit a podcast recording, right? We use digital plugins, and that's totally fine. But I do have some analog compressors, which, is a piece of hardware, right? Hardware that I have here. And so sometimes I'll run the audio through that hardware just to make it sound a little warmer, to make the recording sound a little warmer. It's going to give me a warmer tone. And so I especially use that with music the most. And uh this is a whole topic, of course, compression, how to compress, how to use a threshold, a ratio in a compressor, right? There are just like so many parameters there, the attack, the release, right? So many things. But as I always say, when you apply compression, don't rely on the parameters, but rather use your ears, because in the end, that's what's going to help you. Yeah. So we had a talk with Josh on this, and Caitlin and Madison, right? And we're all looking at the parameters, but what I always say is you have to play with it, right? You just have to listen to it, you have to work with it. The more that you do it, the better you're going to get at it. But it's just a matter of listening, just like with music, right? You have to listen to it. Otherwise, I mean, you could have all the theory, but if you don't listen to it, then it's useless in a way.
You got to listen to it and listen to it again. And yeah, audio's a tricky thing, right? It's kind of like you know it's good when you hear it, and it's not like you can just plug it into some formula and it always comes out the same. Every time is a little bit different. Yeah. So Jose, one kind of to wrap things up a little bit to what I think is a really good discussion. So we could, a lot of this stuff can get really technical, and from the point of view, say, of our clients, they, for the most part, or I could probably say even 100%, they don't really care how it gets done as long as it sounds good in the end, right? But this is really cool because this is, a little, there's a lot that goes into it. And like I said up front, it's more than just taking out some bits and taking out the filler words, right? It's to make the audio sound really good. This is what it takes, right? But so from your perspective as someone who is deep in the weeds with the technical stuff, why does all this stuff ultimately matter? When I say, well, it makes it sound good, what does good actually mean? We listened to two clips just now, and one was, it was a kind of an extreme example, someone recording on a boat and there's wind. That's not typical, right? Most of the time you'll be recording in a room and it's at least, probably pretty quiet. There might be some hum in the background, but it's not going to be literally gusts of wind. So ultimately, to your mind, if you're trying to make a podcast and make it sound as good as it can, why does all this stuff ultimately matter?
I think because it's linked directly to your content. I think in the end, it's all about the content. And if people get distracted by background noise, by having to turn up the speakers, having to turn down the speakers, then of course, your content is going to be affected. People are not going to be as interested. It needs to have that quality for people. And even if they don't know anything about audio, they can hear if something is professional or not. They're just going to say, it sounds good, right? Like it sounds professional. And they don't know why. They don't know what goes into that recording, but they just know it sounds good. So in the end, it's all about the content, because really podcasting, it's all about that, right? It's all about the content. So I think, as I mentioned, I think the more, or the better that your audio sounds, the better that your content is going to come out.
Yeah, Josue, I think that's really a good point, right? Because when we talk about content, and especially audio content, and I guess this would go for video too, really, there's at least two pieces to it, right? There's what people are talking about, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, the topic of conversation, and the dialogue going back and forth. But then there's also, like you say, the quality of the audio itself. And we've all listened to podcasts from time to time where the discussion itself might be really interesting, but if the audio is not good, if it's a little scratchy or if there are artifacts or noise, it's at best that might just kind of be mildly annoying, and you're willing to kind of go along with it because you're really interested in the content. But at worst, beyond if it's beyond just like a little bit bad, and it's like pretty bad, it's almost impossible to keep listening. It's just an unpleasant experience, so it really undermines the quality of what you're talking about. It really undermines the value, even if what you're talking about is awesome and you have this great guest and you're having this really in-depth discussion. The audio matters, the quality matters, because ultimately you're competing against every other podcast out there, and the ones that really take care with the audio and take it to the highest kind of broadcast level. That's you don't want to be on the wrong side of that.
Well, and I wanted to make a point too. Like, so from a filmmaking perspective, where we're working with film and audio, one thing that I have noticed, and then also talking to the sound design background, people, if the content, I'm talking about like a really well put together piece, content wise, the content is really good. Um, People, the audience members, are more willing to forgive bad visual footage for good content. They are not very forgiving if it's very good content, but if your audio is trash, it's, yeah, it's kind of over from the audience's perspective, which I think is, it's kind of interesting, right? Like that we can forgive bad visual footage, but it's, maybe it's something just like human wise that we just can't really connect with whatever piece we're consuming if the audio is truly like in need of help.
I think that's because nowadays we have so many tools to get good audio that I think it's kind of like unforgivable to not have good audio, right? So we have so many tools nowadays, and our music sounds so good, right? Like back in the 80s, but even then, there were some tools to make it sound good. But back in the 80s, it was forgivable, right? Like you could have a bad recording and you would still love that song because it was a good piece of music. But nowadays, like you have so many tools to record, like even at home, right? Like you only need an interface, an XLR mic, and that's all you need to really record a good piece of audio. And so I think this is also one of the reasons, because we're very used to hearing good stuff, right? Also bad stuff, but
Yeah. Well, that is an interesting point, Caitlin, and I think that, and I've noticed that too. And I wonder if there's something even deeper than that. I think you're right, Josue, but something even deeper, kind of like, when you hear an irritating sound like nails on a chalkboard or some high pitched something, like it's physically painful. You know, it's like you can't stand it. And as opposed to seeing, I don't know, something that's like a little out of focus, like it might be a little weird, but it's not like a painful experience, or seeing an image that's not tip top or top quality. I'm just like, oh, okay, But yeah, the there's something I think about the audio, maybe just the way the brain processes sound, that when it's unpleasant, when it's suboptimal, it's kind of repellent in a way that visuals aren't. I don't know why that is, but that, and I don't even know if that's actually true, but that's at least been my experience.
And it's also interesting too with like also microphones and then tonal, we touched a little bit on like tones of voices too, and like what gets picked up by a microphone. Like for example, women's voices that typically are just like a little bit of an octave higher. And I'm thinking too, when it comes to sound, like um children crying, like that, it's like, you don't really want to hear it on an airplane. But like typical, apparently, and then again, I'm not a scientist, so disclaimer there. Caitlin, not a scientist, but like women's ears are built to pick up higher toned sounds than men's are. And the thought and the theory behind it is just like hearing for a child's cry. That's like what the idea behind it is. But it's interesting how that can apply to sound design. And I'm thinking from a film perspective too, of just like making a scary movie, and using like horror music to, you're in the movie theaters, your hair stands up on end, and nothing's really happening on the screen. The person's walking around the TV, but you add those weird pitches, and you're like freaked out because you're like, what's happening next? So This has like been such a cool episode. I've learned about compression, learned about de-essing. We've got to see live examples too, thanks to Josue. But oh my gosh, this has been like a TED Talk, honestly.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, really, really interesting. And it goes right to the heart of what podcasting is all about. I know we're doing a video version of this and there's a lot of video at play, but still most people listen to podcasts. And at the heart of what podcasting really is, it's an audio medium, and that's why it's so important, and that's why we are so fortunate to have Josue, who is truly gifted when it comes to making the audio sound as good as it possibly can. So that's definitely part of our secret sauce. So all right, you guys, well we could definitely keep talking about this, but we're gonna wrap things up. So listeners, thank you so much for once again listening and watching. If you're watching the video, we're going to tell you about all of our social media, of course, because you got to know about it. We're on a lot of social media. We're on LinkedIn. You can find us. Just type in Conversa. That's with 2 N's, CONN Versa. We are on TikTok at Conversa. We are on Instagram at Conversa. Is it Conversa Podcasting?
Conversa, or is it just Conversa? Podcasting. Yep.
Okay, Conversa. Okay, at Conversa Podcasting. We're also on Facebook. If you still go on Facebook, I haven't been on Facebook in a little while, but some people still go on there, so I hear. So check us out on our socials, and we'll be posting some promos for this episode and all our episodes there. And of course, you can find the podcast. You can find the video version on our YouTube channel, and you can find the audio version anywhere you get podcasts, on any podcast app, whatever you happen to have on your phone. We're on all the directories, Apple, Spotify, all those. And what would be really awesome is if you could give us a rating, of course, 5 stars. We will settle for nothing less. And if you really want to go the extra mile, leave a comment. It can even just be a couple of words like, hey, I really like this podcast. Or you can go on and on. We won't mind, about how eloquent Josue was in talking about compression and everything else. So, that's and of course, most important of all, if you like what you're hearing, share the podcast, tell your friends, share it with colleagues. That's really going to help spread the word. So thank you all so much for listening, and check back in a couple of weeks when we'll be dropping another episode of the PodShop.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.